Um, Alrighty. So, first of all, like, what is edge control in painting? And essentially, when we put lines on the canvas, we're showing three-dimensional objects in two dimensions. And so we don't have depth to work with when we're working with those dimensions. So obviously, a 3D program, we have like up, down, left, right, and then we also have back, right? We don't have that in 2D, and so we have to show that in a different way. And one of the ways we can show that is edges. Edges also have to do with how things interact with each other. And so when we talk about like a hard edge or a soft edge, it basically has to do with like how literally like how firm the corner of the stroke is. And we can use this to simulate some really cool stuff like fall off of forms or fall off of light. A really common place where you'll see hard edges are if I take this and lock it, and if I'm making like my cube that I'm going to illuminate, right? Because, or sorry, my sphere that I'm going to illuminate, because this is round, the light doesn't fall off it all at once, right? So in anime art, you'll have what's called cell shading, which is hard edged like this. But if you want it to look realistic, you have to soften that edge because the light doesn't actually fall off all at once. It falls off gradually, right? And so as soon as we soften that edge, now we're showing that this is a rounded surface and that under here we're going back in space. And so that's kind of how we like simulate that third dimension, is oftentimes with edge work. And this is also incidentally what makes a painter, like a painting or a piece of art look painterly as opposed to like modern, is it boils down all to like how the edges are controlled and where. A good example is if we have, let me think about how I can show this. Let's make another sphere. Spheres are easy because they're a very simple form. So let's make a sphere over here like that. And let's imagine that we've got a pole that is going over top of it or something that's like blocking the light on top. I'm going to make that a different color so that we can really like see what that is. And our light source in this case is going to be top down. And there's something that is obstructing the light to our sphere. So what kind of a shadow are we going to get? Well, we can map pretty easily like around the sphere. We're going to be like, okay, well, there's a shadow that goes like this because that's the shape of the thing that's blocking the light. This is called a cast shadow. So that's fine and good. And then we can put our oops, come on, I forgot. Can put our, oh, come on, shadow in, but it doesn't look quite right. Like it kind of works if I hide the thing. You can see, yeah, it's a cast shadow, but it doesn't feel very three-dimensional. This is a very graphic look, very graphic read. And the reason for that is because we don't have any light fall off being shown right now for our sphere. So in order to make our light fall off, we need to use edges to control that. So an example would be if I make this edge softer because the light here is like falling off. And actually I might just make, I guess technically that'd still be shadow. So it'd be these edges would be softer. What is going on with my program here? There we go. So here, first of all, there's going to be some light that's falling off in general, right? Because the sphere is only lit from the top. And then on top of that, the edges of our cast shadow are going to get progressively fuzzier as they get further away from the source, right? So up here, we're closer, so it's going to be a nice hard edge. Down here, we're fuzzing out because it's further away from our cast shadow. And then all of a sudden, we start to get a much more painterly look. And our brains can like interpret, like, oh, okay, I understand what's happening, right? We've got this cast shadow that's falling off progressively as we go down. So these are like super basic examples, but essentially edge control is how we show like how the light is interacting with forms. I want to go one step further, and this is a little bit of like lighting theory, but it's important when we're talking about edges. And then I want to spend most of the time talking about like how mechanically to do like control the edges on your lines. But if we think about like zooming into the top of one of these spheres, like if we zoom way in as if it's like a 3D program, we can kind of envision it as a series of planes. And those planes are going to be at slightly different angles. So this is like microscope view. We're going way into the top of the sphere. And the amount of light that reflects or bounces off of any one of these planes to get back to our eyes or get back to the camera is going to be dependent on the angle of that plane to our eyes. So let's say that we're observing this sphere from over here, and there's a top-down light, right? So or maybe let's make it a raking light. Let's make it like this, right? So depending on how much light is actually bouncing back to our eyes, we can see like here we're going to get more light towards the top, but down here, it starts to bounce off. And light, to be fair, it scatters kind of like a shotgun, so it'll scatter in this range like this. But we're going to be getting less and less of that light as it's going at a more raking angle. And this is what causes soft edges. Over here, it's just missing it completely. So we're going to have, this will be the terminus of our shadow right here. And so this is like the mechanics of kind of why that happens, because we're on these planes in between the light and the shadow, we're getting like some of the light. We're getting some percentage of the light, whether that's 75% or 50% or 20%, right? And that's what's causing that soft diffuse edge. So going back to our sphere now, if we zoom back out and get our nice big sphere here and then lock it so I can paint all in one layer. It could be true that like with our light coming top down, it can't hit anything on the bottom of this sphere. All of these planes are facing too far away from it, so it just doesn't consider it. But there's going to be some amount of planes in between the bulk of the light. So up here, sometimes you'll get what's called a specular reflection, like this, where it'll go even brighter. And that happens when there's certain planes that are like perfectly reflecting the light. So sometimes you'll see this, it depends on the material. And then this in between, you're going to get an area where it's like starting to go into shadow, like you're still receiving light, but you're not receiving all of the light. And so that's where you start to get this kind of a look. And you can do it cell shaded like this if you want. Or if you want it to feel like a more accurate or more painterly, that just basically becomes a soft edge like this. And I'm fuzzing this out with the smudge brush in Photoshop. I've got this brush that's basically a bunch of like little squares that I've set as my brush tip. It's basically simulating like uh, traditional bristles of a brush. But that's why this happens. And you'll get soft edges on anything. You can also get soft edges for like more compositional reasons. So for example, if we have a scene, let me think about this for a minute. So if we have a scene where we've got a cube, let's say, let's keep with some simple geometry. Cube in the scene, like this. And we want to show like the focus of the camera, for example. We want to show that the cube is closer on the front and falling away from us on the back. We can actually use the same thing. So just like you'll see depth of field blur in games or cameras, you can use edge control for that as well. So we can have one side of the cube be nice and sharp, and we can kind of fuzz it out around the edges, maybe where it gets further away from us. This can create a really interesting contrast of like hard edge and soft edge. And that contrast is what makes paintings interesting, because oftentimes as artists, we're putting more of that in there than is in real life. And that's what gives the paintings or the drawings that like life. We're almost like interpreting, well, we're literally interpreting what we're seeing, and we're making it more aesthetically pleasing or more aesthetically interesting. So as far as the practical ways of how to do this, there are a couple different ways, and I want to cover ways that are going to work just the same basically in digital and traditional. So the easiest way is to put a line down and then smudge the edge. And you can do this traditionally as well, especially if you're working with like charcoal. If you're working traditionally with like a pen, like a ballpoint pen, and you don't have the option to smudge your line, sometimes you do. Sometimes you have like water-based ink, so you can, dip your finger in water and smudge it out. But if you don't have the option to smudge your line, that's where we'll use cross-hatching to show edges that are graduating off like this. And of course, with cross hatching, we'll get darker, we'll get more ink in darker areas. So we'll cross like this, and then less ink progressively as that falls off. That also works too. It's more work, but it will eventually create your soft edge. You can also, if you're working with a pencil, you can use it with pressure. So we can simulate this digitally with pressure sensitivity. But that's another example where you press really hard where you want lots of graphite and you let off where you want less, and you'll get a nice transition. Um, the way that I recommend for digital is I like to do the edge control as a separate step. And we're going to do some little mini studies so you can see how this works in practice. But generally speaking, I'll put down my kind of core lines first, and then I will go in and decide which of those edges I want to be hard and which of those edges I want to be soft. And doing it this way lets you kind of think of things in isolation, which helps immensely when you're first starting with edges. Because if you're trying to lay down the edge and the line at the same time, it can get very difficult. It's just a lot to think about. As you practice, it'll get easier. But so that's the gist. That's basically it. There's one other way you can do it digitally, which is you can use a soft brush, and the smaller the brush, the harder the edge. So, for instance, if I have a really small brush, I get a nice, like firm, I guess, edge. And if I make my brush bigger like this, I'm going to get a very soft edge, right? This is another way to do it, and I see a lot of people work this way. I personally don't like it because it's very hard to control. Um, it's easy to get very soft, fuzzy, noodly kind of art, which is kind of a hallmark of amateur art and beginner art. There tends to be a lot of like we don't know exactly where to put the lines, so we'll use a soft brush, and it ends up just feeling kind of fuzzy, which is not a great look. One other thing you can do, which is a very industry style workflow, is using a lasso tool and a soft brush. What this does is this basically it's an upgraded version of the last one, which is to say we get the hard edge from the lasso and we get the soft edge from the brush. Things like this you'll see in a lot of concept art because it's a very fast way to work where you'll basically just be lassoing in your light shapes. So if I had like, I don't know, if I had a sphere, I could literally just lasso in my sphere like this. And then I could just use a soft brush where the light hits like this. And you can see how quickly we can get that same kind of a fall off. The downside of this is it'll give you a perfect edge. It'll give you a perfect digital edge. So unless you have some texture to your soft brush, you might have to go in and smudge it to mix things up a little bit. And then we get some interesting looks. So those are kind of like some technical ways to do it. For me, I usually use either lasso or if I'm sketching, I will just lay it in with the brush and then I have my hotkey set to F for the smudge. So I can switch B for brush, E for eraser, F for smudge. Okay, so let's look at kind of how this works in application, because I can sit here and talk about edges, but the point of this is partially for you to be able to see them if you can't already see them, and partially for being able to like control them, which is another thing that just takes some practice. So if I come in here, I'm going to I'll grab a sketch brush that I use a lot. And we can get into like studies and photo studies at a later point. I'm going to do this very quickly because the point is more about like getting a cloth study in and less about like how to measure things by eye. If this is something people are interested in, we can go into like measurement systems as well. Right now, I'm basically just mocking in or blocking in where I see the main kind of folds of this are. And I'm not trying to be too perfect with it either. It doesn't matter because it's cloth. It doesn't matter if it's exactly perfect. I just want to get the main shapes down real quick. Part of the reason I like to demo is because, in my opinion, especially with art, like if you have a teacher that can't demo in front of you, it's just, I don't know. It suggests that they don't know what they're talking about or don't know what they're doing. So for me, I like to be able to kind of put the money where the mouth is and actually show things live. The other thing is with art and with any sort of I guess, physical learning, like physical application where you're actually making a motion or doing something, it really helps to see it be done in front of you. So we're going to take a little second to do a couple studies here together so you can kind of see how we approach edge control from a study perspective. Okay, so I've got my main shapes in here. And I'm not worrying too much about like the little silhouettes and stuff like that. And then what we're going to do, this is all still hard edge. So I'm still just working with a brush that, I mean, I guess it's got a little bit of texture to it, but it's essentially a hard edge. And so I want to go in and lay in kind of where my main shadow shapes are. So I'm going to lay those in like this. I see a shadow that folds around this way. And I'm going to lay these in as hard edged shapes, even though they're actually not in my reference. And then we will go back separately and soften them as a separate step. So here I see like this. Here we've got a nice strong line that comes down. That's a hard edge. One other thing I should probably point out real quick is when I'm talking about like hard edges and soft edges, let's talk about where those are actually. So a hard edge is where you have an immediate shift in value. So like this line right here is generally a hard edge because we're getting directly from light into dark. There's no like gradation in between. You do actually technically have a couple other types of edge. There's firm. This is what I would call like a firm edge, where there's a clear line, but it is a little fuzzy. And then there's soft. This is an example of a soft transition like this from here to here, where we can see we're dark here and we're light here, but there's no specific point right along that way where we can tell. There's also what's called lost edges, which you won't really see very much in photographs, but that's where two elements have the same or similar value. A good example is, do I have one in here? I might not have a good soft edge in here. I guess you could call this, or I guess you could call this a lost edge where we've got fabric in light right here, and we've got fabric in light right here, and they are kind of blending together. Now, in this case, it's not really a lost edge because we do still have this little highlight to tell us where the edge is. But if we imagine that those were the same value, like this would be called a lost edge, where there is an edge between those two, but we can't see it. Okay, so going back to this, we're just going to block in some other shadow shapes. And then what we want to do is with fabric, we'll notice a trend, which is that the top of a fold tends to be a hard edge where the light is hitting it directly. And then because this is a rounded form, it will soften as it goes into shadow, and it will soften as it rounds back around, and then we get another hard. So if we think about the actual form of this fabric, it'll go kind of something like this. Let me make a color we can actually see, maybe blue. So it'll go kind of like this, around, under, out, like this, right? And every time we have this fold, that's going to create a soft edge. So in this case, we're working from direct reference, but we can actually apply the same exact thing if we're inventing cloth. That works too, because as long as we like understand how the cloth is sitting, we can still make it work. So I'm going to grab my smudge here. I'm going to blur out some of these strokes, these like just cross-hatching strokes. And then we know that we want basically a soft edge on the transition and a hard edge down below. So I'm going to basically go down here. This is down, so I want to make a hard edge here, like this. And then I know I want a soft edge up top. So I'm going to lay down my edge and then I'm going to soften it. And this is the same as like smudging with a finger if you're working traditionally. And then I get another hard edge up here. So I'm going to block that in nice and hard. And then a soft edge at the top of this fold. So that's soft. And you can see how if you do edge control correctly, you're very quickly going to get a sort of three-dimensional look to your art. I'll go ahead and block in kind of loosely according to my reference here. Block in some of these other folds just so that we can get a little bit of a more complete image here. Here's a nice hard edge. And so you can lay down your full sketch first and then get into the edge control. Like here, I see the bottom of that stroke is hard, but the top is soft. So I'm softening the top side of that. You can block all this in at once and then go in and do your edges. That's what I recommend if you're starting with workflows like this, because it allows you to just think of one thing at a time. Right now, I'm kind of going back and forth where I'm laying in a line and then I'm softening accordingly. Either one is totally fine. So here, I'm going to soften this out like this. And this will also give you a very like scholarly kind of atelier look as well. And the reason for that is just because this is how, like, this is basically classical drawing stuff. So here we can soften that out. I see I've got a little bit of a fold down here. Top side of this is soft, so I'm softening. So you'll see I'm just switching between my brush, my eraser, and my smudge tool. And that allows me to basically just make these folds fairly quickly, I would say. So here I can soften just the top of this stroke. You don't want to do this like wildly, or you don't want to do this in an uncontrolled way. because if it's not controlled, you're going to break the illusion. The reason this works is because the soft edges are in the correct spot. And if I were to soften all of these, then all of a sudden I'm not going to have the right illusion of form. So same thing here, like looking at this little fold, I can see that this actually has a much harder edge because it's a smaller fold. So I can even start to play back and forth where I'm going to make this like a firm edge basically. So I'm going to soften it like just a tiny bit. But then up top here, I see I've got kind of inversed because of the way the shadows cast. So here I've got a soft edge on the top or I've got a hard edge on the top and a soft one on the bottom. So you see how as soon as I do that, we get this sense of 3 dimensions. And you can think of it also kind of like sculpting. You're kind of like sculpting light where you're bringing it forward and pushing it back. It's a really fun way to work. And it's a very like painterly way to work. Um, this does work when you're doing sketches as well. I usually don't go too involved with the edge control when I'm sketching because if I'm going to be painting over it, it's like there's less of a point to it. But you can. And so here very quickly we're starting to get this sense uh, of form and of edge. Another thing that's interesting to note is that if you're controlling your edges correctly, you actually don't need the lines. In real life, when we're looking at a subject, it's not usually outlined. We, as artists, put the lines there to denote where the value starts and stops. And so when we're doing sketches and we're doing line drawings, that's basically what we're indicating. When we start controlling the edge, we're basically just copying how it actually shows up in real life. And so you'll notice that if you are doing this, and this is what you'll see in academic drawings, like you actually don't really need the lines. You'll end up fuzzing them out anyway, and they turn into edges. Something that's just interesting with the way that those kind of two things are related. So I think we get the general gist. We can start to see that we're getting a sense of light and shadow. One other thing to be careful of if you're doing it this way is that things will also have an overall like value shift. Here, I just smudged that line too much, so it flattened immediately. Things will have an overall value shift as well, which is very hard to see. But if I look at this shape, I can see that it's actually darker in general down here than it is up here. If you're jumping from shadow to shadow and just controlling edges individually, it's very easy to lose that, which will again kind of flatten your image. So I'm going to put in this fold here, this fold here. And you'll see I'm working very sketchy here because the main point is just showing where the edges are. And it also shows that like this will give your work a very polished feeling to it without having to really dig super far into like rendering. It's also worth noting that I guess you could argue that edge control is just rendering. So there's arguments to be made both ways. Okay. Um, as far as overall light and shadow, that kind of gets more into like value control, but in general, I see that it's darker on one side, so I'm gonna darken that down a little bit, darken it back here, so that we get a little bit of a sense of light and shadow. And then this is another good example where I just use a soft brush to lay that in. So I'm gonna get a soft edge from that, but I don't want it to be soft all over. So I'm erasing away with a hard brush so that I have a nice hard silhouette. And these types of things are what's going to give that like really clean kind of academic look to your work. I've been doing this so far with a textured brush, but just as a demo, I'll show with just a basic hard round. It works exactly the same. There's really no difference. The only difference is that the textured brush gives a little bit more of a graphite or a charcoal feel, which I kind of like, but it's just personal preference. So here I'm doing this with a basic hard round. I see that these are both actually fairly soft edges. One's a little softer than the other. Lay in some value here. So I'm just laying value in and then I'm smudging it around. And if you smudge too much, you can also erase away. You can also erase away for details, like this little fold down here, you can erase for that. And we're just pushing and pulling lights and darks back and forth. So here, softening that edge a little bit. Once you know to look for this as well, if you look at some of your favorite, like especially painters, you'll start to notice it a lot. It's just everywhere, because really, like, especially in painting, edge control is very, very important. You'll also notice with charcoal artists where they'll oftentimes intentionally make edges like overstated. So they'll make them much harder or much softer than they see in reality, which lends to a very dynamic kind of fluid look, which is really cool. Okay, so I think we get the general gist here. You can see how we're getting this very three-dimensional kind of a feel to our cloth here, and that's really we it's just coming from the edges. Edges and value are intrinsically tied, so that's the same thing arguably. But the way that we're thinking about it is less in terms of light and shadow and more in terms of like where are the hard edges and where are the soft edges. And you can think about it either way. You'll still get a good end result as long as you can see them accurately. I can even pull away highlights here and I can soften the edges of my highlights as well. I want to get even more kind of three dimensionality in there. Um, so yeah, that's simple. Cloth is the easiest thing to show because it has very obvious hard and soft edges. But we can look even at, here's a piece of art by an artist named Gabriel Santos. So we can look in here and we can see that he's doing the same thing. So this is a fun and a good study to do if you're starting to try to see edges. We can literally go in here and we can mark like, okay, this transition here is a soft edge, right? Because we're blending out from the edge of the lip. But on the bottom side, this is a hard edge because it's a firm, like it's an immediate transition of value. And so we can see even within this shape right here, if I take this shape, he's got it basically hard on one edge and soft blending out like this. And so that's the shape that we're left with, where it's got a combination of hard and soft edges. And if you do this with master paintings as well, you'll see the same thing. Most shapes are not all hard or all soft. To get that really clean painterly look, most shapes will have a blend of hard and soft edges. That's also what will give you the most interesting shapes, which we can get into at some point with shape design. Um, so same thing here. We'll do a very quick study. We've got our eyeball. And here I'm basically just ignoring the color because the color is not really important. And I'm just focusing on where the edges are. So I've got my eyeball, I've got the lip of the eyelid, and like this, very sketchy still. And down around like this. It's got this little like scar, which I think is kind of interesting. So I'll mark that in real quick. And here is like a corner. He's got this kind of shape to his face. I really like the design of this guy. I think it's a very interesting looking design. His ear in there. I can tell my proportions aren't quite on, but I think they're close enough to show the edges for. So I'm like kind of speeding through this just so we can mess with some edges. I did think about preparing these sketches in advance, but I don't know. I think you see that a lot on YouTube where it'll be like, okay, here's our lesson and here's the pre-prepared thing. I think it's often more useful to just see it start to finish, um, even if not all of that is like the topic that's being discussed, just to see how it's laid out. Okay, so we've got our lips here. So I see hard edge coming around here where we're kind of outlining some of the lip. And in this case, I'm going to treat it more like a pen almost. So I'm going to worry less about marking all the edges, and instead I'm just going to mark the hard edges. We can always soften out the rest later if we want. So I see a nice hard edge around the eyelid here. This is actually fairly soft in here. Another thing you can do when you're trying to see your edges is the same thing you can do when you're seeing values, you squint. So if I squint at this area here, these all kind of blend together a little bit. So I don't need to like be as firm on the outline on that. Whereas over here, if I squint, there's a very clear outline. So I'm going to make sure that that's in there. Up like this and around. Got some shadow here. And I guess this is all still technically layout, but it's all a little bit intrinsically tied together, right? Because edges are tied to value, value is tied to color, like the structure is tied to all of that stuff as well. So like construction and perspective and everything, it all does kind of like come together. So I can work in just laying in like anytime I see like dark accents, specific edges that are really hard, I'm just marking those in very firmly. So like here with the turning of that ear. I'm not sure what this little guy is here, this little blip. Maybe it's a tear duct or something. Remove this head here, coming up around here. And then same thing, if we want to put some value on this real quick, we'll do that and we'll just control the edges as we do it. So squinting at this, I see a lot of this is actually quite dark. And that's kind of, some of that's dark local value, some of that is just shadow in general. So I'm laying in with a hard edged brush. I'm laying in where I'm seeing those dark shadow shapes and just trying to make sure that that kind of lines up with my understanding of the form, because sometimes it won't, and then that's where you get into trouble. So I'm making sure that lines up. Got some shadow under here. If you do things like this with a hard brush and then control the edges separately, even digitally, you'll end up with a very watercolor look as well, because you're basically just building value, which I think is cool. So push stuff back. And then same thing, we're going to go in and just start controlling these edges. So I know I want basically a firm edge here and a firm edge here. Then I know I want to soften out as it blends into the bottom part of the face. I can also go in and control like where these turn. Same thing down here. There's basically a hard edge at the bottom, so I'm going to erase away from this shape to get that hard edge. And then I grab my smudge tool to get the soft that's up top. Computer's a little laggy today, I'm not really sure why. But as we start to jump around the image, if you do this right, again, you'll start to see kind of this sense of three-dimensional form emerge from your lines, which is a very satisfying process. It's one of my favorite types of processes. Right now, we've got values kind of all over the board, but I will fix it with a little bit of time. So here, even within my shadow, I see there's a harder edge right here. I don't know if you can see that shape. It's like the cheekbone shape. So I'm going to put that in, push back and forth to get that look. Moving up here, I've got a nice hard edge on the edge of this ear, but it actually does soften out the bottom. So I'm just going to add that in there. Same thing here. There's a little bit of an edge that we can see coming around like this, but it's basically hard on one side, soft on the other. This is all soft. Here I've got a nice hard edge. So I'm basically laying in shapes and then smudging corners of them out to get my overall shape. Here, this is basically hard edged on the bottom for the most part. But then this is very similar to our clothing folds where the top sides of these are soft. So I can lay in my strokes like this, soften. So some of this is a little more just like there's a lot happening here, right? And I understand that there's more than just edge control happening where I'm messing with values and stuff like that. But the premise of this is like assuming that most of the people here or most of the people watching this have at least a basic understanding of like light and shadow. And we can always do that as well in um, a separate atelier if we want. But in this case, I'm trying as much as I can to separate the edge control from the values and rendering and stuff like that. Because the point of this is something that like I struggled with a lot when I was coming over to digital art from traditional, is just like it was really hard to deal with edges and controlling them. And so like there was quite a bit of time where I just couldn't get the same look digitally as I could traditionally, and it drove me up the wall. So I figured this might be useful if anybody else is in a similar area. And just getting stuck into values a little bit now. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, get our people in there. It looks like for the most part, this is all fairly hard edged. Don't see many soft edges in the pupil there. I do see that there's a counter reflection on the eyeball, and some of those are harder than others. So here I see some hard edge shapes and some soft. So I can block in the overall value statement first, and then I can kind of mess with it, fudge it around, soften the areas I need. Same thing back here. Some of this as well, you can always go in with like a soft round brush. Soft round is great for general form. So I'm going to show you what I mean here. Like this eyeball is a very round form. So I could mess back and forth with trying to get a perfect like round looking sphere. Or what I could do is I could select the area that I'm wanting to mess with. You can hit Control H to hide the ants if they bother you. And then I can go in with my soft round and I get the hard edge for free like that. And now I get a very convincing kind of eyeball shape. And then I can go in, like the specular highlight that he's got here is very hard edged. So I can just go in and add this. And it's a very fast way of getting value down. Anyway, hopefully this kind of helps with understanding like the difference and what makes edges important and what makes a hard edge versus a soft edge. Um, I don't know if that's useful or not, but hopefully at least one person finds it useful. I'm going to keep kind of noodling away at this, but I don't want to have this whole thing just me doing a study. So I guess I'll open it up if there's questions, maybe starting first with any questions about edges or edge control, and then we'll open it up into just general questions if anybody has any. And I can see the chat as well as you can just unmute. Either's fine.
I was gonna ask if sometime you could do like a lesson when it comes to like different surfaces and materials and how light would reflect off of those, like skin or
Absolutely.
something.
Yeah. Yeah. So interestingly enough, materials are also basically all value and edge. um, there's a little bit of an element of color there, but yeah, we can absolutely do that. I can say like at right off the bat, it basically boils down to how wide your value range is and what types of edges are present. So for example, like with this eyeball, the fact that this specular light is a hard-edged shape tells us that it's very glassy or reflective. If I softened this, it would start to feel more like clay or something. Um,
Mm,
so it basically boils down to how wide your values are, meaning like how dark and how light does it get in relation to each other? And then also what are the edges within those values? And that's basically how you can indicate pretty much any material. But yeah, I think next week then we'll do a quick lesson on materials and how to render them and how to see them. And it'll actually kind of dovetail pretty nicely with what we talked about this week because it's all related.
Also, when are you gonna we talked about this last week, but you talked about going over like ways you could photo bash without running into issues.
Yes,
What
that's
are
gonna
that?
be that's gonna be the Ask an Art Director this week. So in 2 days, I
Cool.
guess. Wait, 3 days? 2 or 3 days. I don't remember if I think I had it on Saturdays. So 3 days. I figured I would do it in the Ask an Art Director because it's dealing more with like logistics, as far as like how much can I use and where do I need to be careful of legality stuff and whatnot. So yeah, that'll
Mhm.
be the next session or the next event that happens here is going to be covering that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions? We can open it up as well if you have questions about just art stuff in general. No questions, huh? Oh, I see Ragnor's typing.
Yeah. Um, it's like so when you do a painting, I mean I don't know if it's exactly related to edge, but like when you use textured brush,
Mhm.
uh, do you swap texture brush depending on the material? Because like I feel like um, I don't know, like sometimes I struggle to render some materials, and I wonder like if it's like because of uh, sometimes I don't want it to be like I mean I want to use a texture brush, you know, to have like a painterly kind of stuff, you know,
Mhm.
and then when I need to refine, then I will lose some of this. And
Yeah.
how to be clear? I don't know if that was a bit clear, but
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I do most of my rendering just like you're seeing me doing it here, which is basically with the hard round brush, a smudge tool, and a soft brush. Um, you can use textured brushes. So I have some here. Let's see. I don't use most of these. Here's a good example. Brushes like this. But I guess like I basically use them in the same way. So like it's the difference is that now there's some texture. You'll see it gives like a little bit of a grittier look to the art. So here it'll give it a little bit of a more like uh, maybe a little bit more traditional feel. Feels like there's like paper texture or something behind it. But the way that you're approaching is the same. Um, when you're using brushes to render materials, you kind of have to, how can I describe the best way to do it? You kind of have to have the textured brush be your top layer. So, for example, you'll see this a lot in foliage if you're doing like leaves or something. So we'll switch to some color here. So if I'm doing like an area of grass or leaves or something, oftentimes the way that I'll do it is I'll build up a base of just flat first. And then if you have whatever, like a foliage brush, I think I have one here somewhere. Yeah, like a foliage brush like this, you can use the brush as your top layer to get that texture. But I think what you're talking about is like then the problem is that if you go back and paint into it again, you're going to start to lose that texture, which is true. And the only way to really deal with that is either you keep your texture on a separate layer. So this is a bad brush to demonstrate this with, but see, I'm gonna clean this up a little bit. Give me a second. I'll show you what I mean. So if I clean this out, I'm just using again a basic hard round, and I'm building my kind of gradient for where I want stuff to go. And then I guess if this is a bush, it would be lighter at the top, darker at the bottom. And then I want to show like there's leaves within that bush. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just pop a layer on top of it, and that's where you can use your textured stuff. So for example, I think one of these has a bunch of textured brushes that I never touch, but occasionally come in handy for, here we go. Here's like an oily blotch. Why not? This will be our leaves. So I can go in here like this and get my like texture, right? Whether this is an actual leaf stamp or not, it's fine. And by keeping that on its own layer and even erasing away with a textured brush, sometimes you can get cool looks. But yeah, if you try to do it all together, it's just going to blend into nothing. Because if I go back and forth with this, man, I don't ever touch these brushes. Not sure where. I know there is one. Maybe rough wild blending. Sure, that sounds like a fun time. Yeah. This is the downside. This is actually, incidentally, this is why I stopped using these brushes, is because I spent more time looking for the right brush than just painting. But here, I will erase away with our textured brush like this. And basically what I've done here is I've left the top layer as my like texture. And then if I need to adjust stuff, I can adjust it directly on there. but you kind of get like 1 to 2 layers tops of texture before it starts to just look like nonsense. Um, so that's the downside of texture brushes. I don't know if that kind of answers your question as far as how to use them, but
Yeah,
yeah, carefully.
yeah, because I feel like one of the things that's like I realized that was like the fake good idea is like, oh, I have this texture brush for that, and I have this texture brush like for stone, and I have this texture brush for like even if it's not like just like a stump of a stone, it's just like a gran. It's like a very rough brush,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
say.
yeah.
So it looks like stone-ish, and then I have this other that is like way more soft, that looks like I don't know, like silk or whatever. And but then you end up like having a even like if you try to have like yeah, you end up with like different texture, and it
Mm,
looks like it's not part of the same painting anymore because you're using
correct. Yeah.
too many brushes.
Yeah, and that'll happen for 2 reasons. One of them is like if you put texture all over your scene, then you just get a very visually noisy scene. The other thing, and you'll see this a lot in like comic art, but speaking of like soft transitions, right? If we think back to like old school comic book inking, it was just ink, right? So you have basically on and off. And so what they would do is if they were drawing like a moon or something, they will leave the lines suggestive. So like here we've got, let's say the top side is the light side of the moon. And then of course we know that our dark side of the moon is just dark, dark, right? So this will be all filled in. I don't know why there's smoothing on this brush, but drive me crazy. And then what they'll do is they'll cut back and forth to make a terminator or to indicate the texture on the middle. So for example, the moon has craters. So they'll mark these crater marks along that middle section only, where we get that raking light. And same thing on the other side, they'll cut away like this. And you'll end up with an indication of texture. This is a really bad brush for this, but you'll end up with an indication of texture. They'll even sometimes, if we want to show that the edge is here, we'll use light for that. Um, and yeah, you can kind of start to get this feeling of texture throughout, even though it's only really oriented on the middle part. This looks more like a really messed up golf ball than a moon, but um, yeah, if you look up like comic book inking, you'll see this type of thing a lot. And that's something you can do when you're painting as well, where you're basically controlling your texture. You can leave it on like the terminator of things. That works pretty well. You can put more texture into your subject. That works pretty well. So here in our little example, he's left it pretty broad brush strokes in the back. And then we see that the strokes get more tight and descriptive on our main character. It's a good way to control like your composition. It's a good way to control focus. But yeah, if you just use like a bunch of brushes all over, it doesn't tend to work very well. One thing you can do though is you can, like for instance with our plant here, let me take off the top layer of texture because I don't think that was working very well. So you can, if your brush cooperates, can get your base like this. And then if I want like specific leaf shapes, you can actually like cut specific leaf shapes out and put them on their own layer. It's kind of like making a brush specific to the thing that you're actually drawing. And I'll show you how to use this in a second. So you cut your leaf shapes. I'm lassoing them right now. I'm going to put them on their own layer. And then I'll grab a soft round brush because hard edge soft brush or hard lasso soft brush. I'll block those leaves in. And then what I can do is I can take that shape and I can duplicate it and move it around. So I can like flip it and warp it and go nuts. And that's another way to get like fairly believable looking like trees and leaves and stuff. But again, you're just going to find that if you go crazy with texture, like you would be surprised how often like fine art paintings don't use that much texture. They leave it very suggestive. Um, and it works really well. This kind of sort of works. I don't know. You'd have to really layer the crap out of it for it to start feeling right. But um, yeah, it's like very warpy. You can start to get kind of the similar feeling because this is basically what brushes are doing, right? They're just stamping the same shape over and over. The problem with that is that when you stamp the same shape over and over and over, you're going to end up with like kind of a weird looking feel because that doesn't really happen that much in nature. I don't know. This is not a very good demo of this. Don't really know why that's not working. Lighter on top. Go in and cut in, and then you can cut in dark shapes underneath it. So I can grab my dark and cut in like my leaf shapes coming up and out. But yeah, this is another way you can kind of approach it. I don't know if I've like specifically answered your question, which is that just that happens because when you have texture everywhere and it's not controlled, it just blends into nothing. So the easiest way, if you're going to use texture brushes, is use them in a very controlled and consistent pattern. That way you can get the benefits of the brush without losing it. A big one that I see actually, this is a really shit demo, but that's okay. A big one that I see is hair. And hair basically is treated like a ribbon, but people tend to fixate on the individual hairs. And so a really like basic way that I teach students to do hair is you'll make your outline and block it in. And then we're going to hit our highlights where the ribbon's turning. So let's say here and here. And then what you can do is instead of getting like a hair brush, which tend to be a lot of strands everywhere, which just gives a very messy look, you can basically just take a single brush or even like just a couple. So here's a good example of like a hairbrush where you see there's like a lot of strands to it. This one's okay because it blends together in the middle, but still that'll give you a very like messy look. What I'll usually do is I'll take something like a flat brush, like this maybe, and rotate it. And then what we can do is sample from one and drag it into the other, like this, and sample from one and drag it into the other. And what this will do is it will create the impression of all of those strands, again with the smoothing, creates the impression of all those strands without actually having all of those strands. And you can break the silhouette a couple places, like this example, or like this. And then you can even hit like little highlights as well. So here I've only got 2 values, but I can hit a couple highlights like this, highlights over here. And this is very fast, but you'll pretty quickly, you can see as we zoom out, we're starting to get the impression of hair. And that's really what it boils down to is you want the impression of what texture you're drawing. You don't really want to fixate on the individual things that make that up. We want to just give the viewer the sense of that thing, whatever that is. So as I cut back and forth here, we're basically telling the viewer like, oh, look, all of these are individual strands and they're making a single mass, right? We're not actually trying to draw all of those strands. We're just trying to give the sense of what the texture actually is. You'll see anime hair does this with highlights where it does these highlights like this. It's just because it's showing like, look, there's a highlight band here across a bunch of different small individual forms. But it would look a lot worse if they actually drew all of those forms in. So here we're getting like, can show a little bit of this. We can even cut away from the shape if we want a more complex shape. So I can say, okay, I want the hair to split here like this. Delete that. And then maybe we see one strand carries through. But it's all about like showing individual elements without actually showing all of them. You want to show the forest, not the trees. And you can apply this to like most textures. I don't know if that helps. Basically, you're asking an excellent question that is like its own talk, realistically. But
Yeah. No, yeah, it's just like when I do some painting, sometimes I feel like the texture on my brush makes it difficult to work with like sharp edges. Like sometimes you have a brush that is like too smooth. So, but I guess it's solved by using lasso and stuff like that.
yeah, anytime you need a crisp edge, that's what I do. I use lasso and then a soft brush. And you can also do, I think I have like a soft brush with some texture in here. This one has a little bit of textured. I had at one point a soft brush that had actual texture on it. I don't use it that much. Maybe it's not in here. I guess this one kind of works. No, that does not. Never mind. Watercolor works. So here's an example of like, get my hard edge, with my kind of softish brush that's textured, and you get an interesting look from that, which is cool. It just depends like how textured you want your image. The other thing that's worth noting is that like texture, very fine detail texture, tends to be something we pay more attention to in illustration. Whereas like for me, I lean more concept art. And concept art, usually you'll do a rough indication, or what you'll do is you'll paint your main forms and then you'll bash in your texture. So you'll just grab like whatever grit texture and you'll bash it over top, um, which is also a way of working. And that lets you control the texture very fine grained because it's non-destructive. So, but yeah, by far the best. It's the slowest, but the best way to control your texture is like this guy did, where he's just basically using a hard round for the vast majority of this. He's got an overall canvas texture that he's put on top, so that it looks like more traditional. But all of this is just hard round, and he's just noodling into his own stuff to get pits and divots and whatever, just manually. So, cool. Hopefully that helps. I don't know why this bush didn't work. I'd have to go back and do more foliage stuff. I know that that technique does work and I've used it before. I'm just not sure why it's not working there. Cool. Other questions? Seems like no. Cool. Well, yeah, that's basically, we'll kind of call that today. So on the Ask an Art Director one, we'll be talking about like copyright and how that applies to you as an artist. And then, fairly important, next week there will not be either of the two sessions because I'm going to be in a place with no internet for the week. So we will pick it up then the following. So we'll have Ask an Art Director this week, and then nothing for a week, and then we'll be back to the regular schedule. So yeah, that's all I got. Unless you guys want to sit here and watch me render out this eyeball. So yeah, thanks for hanging out, guys. Much appreciated. And if there's no other questions, we'll call it there. I'm gonna kill the recording.